Proverbs 23, and we're going to look at verses 1, Proverbs 23, verses 10, 11, and 12 this morning. Proverbs 23, verses 10, 11, and 12. Proverbs 23, verses 10, 11, and 12. And of course, last time we looked at verses 1 through 9. We talked about power and profit. And we have to be very careful because power and profit are very alluring. Okay, we watched a documentary this Saturday on a ministry in Colorado where power and profit really plays a big part. It was really kind of sad and interesting research the fellow did and things he brought out and anyway, so quite fascinating. But power and profit. These are not the things that we should live for because why? Well, we're children of God. Power is there, right? It's God's power. We don't need power. God's got power, We don't need to worry about having power because all we have to do is pray to the Heavenly Father, right? And if it's something the Heavenly Father wants to done, it'll be done. It's just that simple, okay? And as far as profit goes, the Scripture admonishes us that, be content with the things that you have. And because he said he'll never leave thee nor forsake thee. So we have Christ. So in Christ we have all the power that we ever would want, and it's not even ours, and we have all the profit because we have Christ. And so we shouldn't be of a mindset to crave power and influence and profit and seek those kinds of things. So today he references this. Again, this is the Father writing the Son, and these are Proverbs, these are observations and admonitions that are given. Verse 10 says, remove not the old landmark and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. And verse 11, for their Redeemer is mighty, he shall plead their cause with thee. And then apply thy heart unto instruction and thine ears to the word of knowledge. So here's advice with a take heed to what I'm telling you now, boy. And this is very important. Remove not the old landmarks. Okay, don't get rid of don't be shifting those around. And of course, we know what a landmark is. It's a way to determine the boundaries of a piece of property. Okay, and so it may be done by a fence. Okay, it could be done by just a stone, to mark the beginning of one territory and the other, and we could use other natural things such as a river or a mountain range, or say there could be things set up to help us understand that this particular piece of property beyond that belongs to someone else. Okay, it's not yours, and so don't move it. Okay, don't move the landmarks to where suddenly now you can claim legal rights to a piece of property you definitely don't have legal right to because you moved the landmarks. It's like having property lines. We all have neighbors, and you guys have neighbors on either side because you're in more the middle of the street. We're just beyond the corner. We end up with neighbors on both sides. It'd be like me going to sleep, and then one night I get up in the morning and the neighbor's gone out there and moved the walls closer to my property, on both sides. So suddenly now my piece of property is much smaller. Why? Because they want to do something and they need a little bit more land to do it. So they move the landmarks in order to get more land. Okay. Now this was something that was very important to understand. Now he says here, I'm going to look at some verses. I want us to see some verses here as well, and because I think it's important to understand the teaching, because it's not the first time we've encountered this. Proverbs 22:28, for instance, says, remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. Okay, so in this particular proverb, it is still referring back to something even further back, and it's back in Deuteronomy, okay, in which specific rules were set up, and the Israelites were taught these particular rules. And what was it for? It was for when they entered into the promised land, okay, and everybody started inheriting their land. Well, they were to sit down and agree, here's your portion. A friend of mine ministers on an Indian reservation up in the Dakotas somewhere. And anyway, and they were looking to possibly get land to build a church building or something like that on. And one of the little old ladies in the church comes to him and says, well, the tribe hasn't given me all the land that I'm entitled to, so I'm going to go petition for the land that I'm entitled to, and we can use that land to build the church on. I'll give it to you. Like she couldn't give it to him, but I'll let you use it to build the church on, because she was allotted a certain number of acres, or however they did it. Nothing had been actually given to her, and so she was going to ask for that which she was entitled to. And so the 12 tribes, well, not the 12, we know there was a couple stayed on the other side of Jordan, but they moved into the land. They were entitled to the land, right? But they still had to divide it up and figure out where's Naphtali going, where's Judah going, where's all. But then you even get down even to inside those boundaries, and now each member of the tribe has to petition for his piece of the land. And so the fathers sat down when they first moved in, okay, and over that period of conquesting time, they managed to settle down that you're going to get, Judah's going to inhabit this area, okay, and Judah's not just going to inhabit that area, but Jesse's going to get a certain area, right? And then so it just goes down, 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 and you have these little areas, but everybody has to set up landmarks so they know where I'm stepping over from, one person in Judah, or Judah knows I can't step over there, that's Naphtali, or Dan, or I don't think Naphtali and Dan were anywhere close, but nevertheless, I can't step over there because that's their tribal land, and I can't step over here because that was bequeathed to that house, and that's that house's land within that tribe. And so the law was developed because of the fact that people would move those. You see, well, the fathers would agree on it all, and everything got parceled out, right? And all the land was parceled out, and everybody knew who belonged to what, So if you were of the house of Jesse, you could parcel out Jesse's land, but you weren't taking your neighbor's land. You know what I'm saying? Each son could get a piece of Jesse's land because they were Jesse's sons, but they couldn't walk over the boundary to the neighbor that wasn't maybe an uncle, a cousin, whatever, but it wasn't Jesse's land. So Jesse's sons couldn't inherit that land unless, of course, he had no one to inherit it to, which was the only way after everything was sorted out they could get more land. They had to marry into it to get it, right? And they only got to keep it depending upon the laws of inheritance, because God intended for every tribe and every house to have its own land and its own boundaries to be responsible for that land. So they set up the landmarks, okay, in order to know where everything was at. I doubt they were putting up wrought iron fences or chicken wire fences or anything like that. So it was probably heaps of stone that just said, hey, you're walking over here. And so it was in Deuteronomy 19:14, thou shalt not move thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land of the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it. Okay? So it was a part of the law. Don't do this. Now, when we're in Proverbs, we're just seeing observations about life. Okay? And you really, you know what? If my neighbors got up overnight and pushed the fence in to get more land, that wouldn't create neighborly affection. What does that generally create? A lawsuit. To push things back to the boundary. Right? So it's an observable. Don't take that which doesn't belong to you, especially in this of these inheritance. Don't do that. Because this indicates, where your rights stop and where your neighbor's rights starts, okay, as far as land ownership. And so very clearly, it was an observable thing, that the common sense thing, don't mess with the landmark. God made it, he codified it in Deuteronomy by saying don't do that. But then in Deuteronomy 27:17, he said this, cursed be he that removeth his neighbor's landmark. And all the people shall say, amen. This is that situation where they were, one group got on one mountain and one group got on another mountain, and they shouted the law back and forth. One said, blessed be, and then the other side said amen, and the other said, cursed be, and the other side said amen. And they were to do this and rehearse the law, okay, on their way in. And so it was a unique situation. And so here, Deuteronomy 17, they had to say, curseth be the man, or he that removeth his neighbor's landmark. And then everybody went, amen. So let it be so. So I can observe from this then, at least within the context of Israel and the kingdom of Israel, well, it wasn't a kingdom at this time, but it was with God as king, but not a human kingdom, that it was a serious offense because God pronounced a curse on the person. And all the people had to agree, yeah, okay, cursed be the one. That meant if they did it, they were going to be cursed too. So God was very serious about this, that don't remove the landmarks which your fathers have set. Don't remove the landmarks, because this is an old time inheritance. Don't mess with this. God promised this. Don't fool with it. And cursed be the person that does. Okay? And so this was a very heavy thing, even in Job, which most scholars think is probably one of the oldest lines, at least in the scripture. Job 24:2, remarking on people like this, some have removed the landmarks. They violently take away flocks and feet thereof. And so even in the days of Job, before the Proverbs were penned and before the law was penned, it was a thing. Some have removed the landmarks. Then they violently took away the flocks and fed on them. So this was the attitude they had toward this practice of moving these landmarks. And then again, a landmark is just simply a boundary, or by extension the territory enclosed therein, a border. It could be a coast. It doesn't matter what it's made out of. I think in most cases it was for the tribes as a whole, probably geographical landmarks. For houses within that tribe, it was probably stone border. They had, if they didn't have something that really stuck out and said, "Hey, that's your," then they would just build this pillar of stones, and say, "Okay, everything in that direction from these pillars of stone belongs to that house, and everything on this side belongs to that," so they had to all set up that way. But it was a very serious thing. In our text, okay, it goes on and it extends it even past that by going, "Remove not the old landmarks," which again, the same principle in Proverbs 22, 28, and Deuteronomy and Job mentioned, "and enter not into the fields of the fatherless." Then he goes on in verse 11 to say, "For their Redeemer is mighty, and he shall plead their cause with thee." So, to move the landmarks of a person or a house or an individual who could defend himself, right? To where there was a dad there, okay? There was somebody there to stand up for his rights, okay? And to push back if you were to do something like that. That's bad enough. That brings a curse, just doing it, right? It was something looked down upon by the old patriarchs. They violently take it. This is horrible. But this proverb takes it one step further and says, well, okay, how much worse would it be then if you moved the landmark of those who didn't have the ability to defend themselves? Okay? They find themselves, and it says fatherless here, so we're looking at essentially orphans, but because they didn't have a male heir, okay, to stand up for the inheritance rights. Because you remember, it was difficult. Everything went to the men, because that issue was brought up by the daughters of Caleb, right? Who they had no sons, and so they were talking about inheriting their land. What are they going to do? What should we do? Because our father will have no house, and they decided, well, okay, well then in this case, let the women inherit it, okay, and let them use it. Of course, they'll marry, obviously, and then their husbands will use it, but ultimately at the end it has to go back to the house of Caleb. It can't go on to whoever they marry. If they marry someone from another tribe or even from another house, he doesn't get to keep it. It has to go back to the house of Caleb. But at least while it doesn't get to be absorbed by some other house, because Caleb has no male heirs, the women can hold the title to that property and they can use it, and their husbands can use it, but ultimately their husbands don't own it. It has to go back to the house of their father. So they set these things up to do that because this was a genuine issue. Well, okay, that's great. So everything inherits down the male line. Well, what if there aren't males? Because Caleb was given an inheritance. Well, and nobody is supposed to be able to take inheritance away from a house, from a tribe. So what are we going to do? Because he's going to lose it because there's nobody to take it after he's only got 3 daughters. And so they had to come up with that concept. And so, but here we're talking about the fatherless. So we're not talking about wives necessarily. We're talking about orphans, people who don't have the male heir to stand up and go, who has the legal right to stand up and go, this is my land. You are trespassing on it. You've moved the landmark. And so now I'm going to challenge this, and we're going to push back. Well, God says, especially in cases of that, where you know that land is owned by people who don't have someone who can legally fight back, you better double down on your ethics here and don't even think about that. Because who? Their Redeemer. Now, who's the father to the fatherless? God is. And God says, let me tell you something. There may not be a daddy down there to stand up for them, but if you try this, I will stand up for them. And you'll wish there was a daddy that stood up for them. Because when I get done with you, okay, when I finish disciplining you, let me tell you something. You'll wish you'd been sued. Because you'd have come out better if you'd been sued. Because when I get done with you, there's no law of man, no court of law that I have to abide by. I will do what I believe is just in this situation. You won't be hiring no fancy lawyers to argue your way out of it, to negotiate some less of a punishment. Not in God's court. Okay, we only have one advocate in God's court, and that's Jesus Christ the righteous. Okay, and if you think for a moment He's going to find a technicality or allow you to get away with a technicality when you have done something that God finds this obvious reprehensible. I mean, He says it's a curse on those who take it from people who can defend themselves. But now here's people who can't defend themselves. If He's pronouncing a curse on someone who can, you've done something to who can defend themselves, then what do you think His attitude is going to be over here when you go after somebody who can't? And this is why the Father goes on and says, now apply your heart to instruction. Better hear me. Okay? And thine ears to the words of knowledge. Because think about it, He just talked about power and profit, right? Well, let's face it. Land is power and profit. Okay? Always has been. Okay? Ultimately, always will be. Okay? And land is power and profit. So the more land you can scoop up, the more profitable you can be. Okay? So then God moves over here and He says, well, okay, don't move the old landmarks. Okay? Don't enter into the field of the fatherless. Don't prey on those who are weaker in order to increase your power and your profit. Well, you shouldn't be hungering after power and profit anyway. Okay? But here's how people got more power and got more profit, especially in the days the Proverbs were being penned. You sucked up more land. Because the more land you had, the more flocks you could have. Or the more vineyards you could have. Or, you know what I'm saying? You could expand your agricultural productivity. Okay? And so that meant wealth. So here's a field over here. You ain't got nobody. Nobody to defend them. I'm just going to push these rocks just a little over this way. Okay? Or what are they going to say? Run the sheep over into that field. What are they going to do? You know? That kind of thing. God says, I'm going to tell you, they ain't going to probably do anything, but I'll take care of it. Because I ain't having that. You know? Give you a biblical example, kind of down this road. It does actually show the inheritance thing. But that's Ahab and Naboth's vineyard. Right? Ahab had his own land. He had his tribal inheritance and the inheritance of his house, but then so did Naboth. This so happens that Naboth had a piece of property, a very nice one, that obviously, if it was that good, it means Naboth was taking care of it. I mean, he had cultivated it, planted his vineyards, taking care of them, and it was good grapes. And so all of a sudden, there's Ahab. He's looking over, and oh, wow, that's a nice piece of property over there. Really love that one. That's good. Oh, them grapes are going to be nice. That wine's going to be nice. That's going to be a great place to own. And so he tries to do what? He tries and all that. He tries to buy it. Okay? That means you couldn't do that. Okay? Because you're talking about either property going from one house to another or from one tribe to another, and that wasn't. You could rent it. You know, you could lease it, but you couldn't own it. Ahab wanted to own it. Okay? He didn't want to lease it. He wanted to own it. Otherwise, what's the problem, with leasing it to him, other than maybe Naboth didn't want to lease it because he obviously had some crops about to come in. He didn't want to lose it. And it was obvious Ahab wanted it for what it was, the vineyard. He wasn't trying to turn it into a cotton field or something. I mean, he wanted it for what it was. But the point is he couldn't buy it. He wasn't allowed to buy it. Okay? Because it belonged, and that was Naboth's argument. I can't sell it because it belongs to my family. It's a inheritance of my house. I may be using it right now, but I can't sell it to you. Okay? Remember they had the years of Jubilee, where even if you leased something, it all had to go back in the year of Jubilee. You didn't get to keep it because God set these landmarks down. And when he set these landmarks down, they were never to be moved. That way, every tribe always had its boundaries, and every house always had its boundaries. Okay? And every Israelite had a place to go, had a home. Okay? That was the point. Everybody had their specific place, so you don't start messing with those boundaries, because when you do, then all of a sudden people start losing out. And we know the story, what happened there. His pagan wife arranged a character, started with a character assassination campaign, and then went from that into literally killing him. At which time, obviously, Naboth didn't have a male heir that could jump up and go, okay, this is my vineyard now. So Ahab took it, right? Hey, it's all mine now. I got it now. There's no one to stop me from taking it now. Oh, but there was one. And his name was God. And isn't it funny how everything that Ahab and Jezebel did, their death sentence was pronounced because of that stupid vineyard? He's walking through the vineyard. Here comes the man of God. This is it. Sorry. You're dead, dude. So's your wife, by the way. Matter of fact, the only thing that's going to be left to her are the palms of her hands. The dog's going to eat everything else. Why the palms of the hands? Because it was her hands that turned around and caused the death of Naboth. But even in our day and time, no question, it's her. It's her. God intended this. It's funny when you read Scripture and you think all the bad things these people are going to do, and you just know they're coming up and sort any time now, And then when you get to the thing, that thing, in which God goes, all right, we're done. We're done. And then the death sentence is carried out, and even described. To me, it's funny because you look at their this continuous, all these rotten things that they do, and all this preaching and these prophets God sends, and everything that goes on, and then you get down to Naboth's vineyard, and God says, "Done. We're done. We're done. We're done. We're done with you." Now, I don't think. I think that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. But let's face it, they weren't get a death sentence for this, but it was the final blow. Okay, it was the final blow. It's kind of like, there's a lot of things you can do within the confines of something, where you're pushing the boundaries, but you haven't broke through the boundaries. You're just there, and but then when you step over the boundaries, God's just like, okay, look, you've pushed. Now you've stepped over the boundaries. We're done. For lack of a better illustration, I know I use my animals too much, but Lizzie Bell, is one to push the boundaries. Okay, and we let her out and play in the back garden. Everything's great. She's out there. She come back in when I go out there and tell her to come back in, and all the kind of stuff. And then one day she wasn't there anymore. She ran off. She came back by the end of the day. Okay, she doesn't get out. She doesn't get let out in the backyard anymore. You know why? Because she went across the boundary. Go over there and lay on the edge of the fence. Get right there at the edge, and I'm watching you, girl. But don't jump that fence. Don't jump that fence. She jumped the fence. Now she's lost her privilege, so to speak, from going outside. Now, I don't think she understands what she did. And I'm not even worried if she understands what she did. I'm just not going to let her out there to do it again because I don't trust her. That was the mouthiness we got this morning. She went out the back door. And I won't let her out the back door because I don't trust her. Because I don't know how she got over that fence. And I don't know how, or if there's a hole, I just don't know. I don't trust her anymore. So they're, okay, let her out there, let her out in the sunshine. I don't like it. I like to go out and roll around in the dirt and all that kind of stuff, and do those things. But then there was the day where she broke through, and that was it. She lost her privileges. I'm done. I don't trust her. Unless I can figure out some way of getting her out there and keep her from, she ain't going back out again. And I think in some respects, God says, okay, you're playing with fire. It's my dad's expression. You're playing with fire, boy. And, because you're pushing it. But there are a lot he'll tolerate within that. And he'll give warnings. And then all of a sudden you get to that edge. And then all of a sudden you can't stay in that edge anymore. You're over it. It's like one time, now the illustrations are flooding back. And my family went swimming in a creek. And in Oklahoma, and it was big. This was creek. I don't even know what creek it was. We were driving along. It was a hot day in the summer. And all of a sudden, the cars pulled over and the side of the road. And I'm like a little kid. I don't know what's going on. I'm like, what's going on? You know, and they're, oh, look, we're going to go down. So everybody goes down to the creek to swim, you know, in the creek and stuff like that. And my sister, Tina, and I were only 2 children, young children at the time, with this group. And so they put us up on the bank. We were sitting in the water. Okay. We're sitting in the water. But it was just, you know, even sitting down, it wasn't really coming up that high. You know, we were just sitting in the water. So we got to be in the water while the adults and the teenagers were out there in the middle. And I remember they talking about they found this barrel that was there, and they were standing on the barrel and they were jumping in. You know, it was under the water, some of this barrel. Now I think I wouldn't be putting my bare feet on this thing, but under this water all this time. But they're jumping and they're having fun. And I can see them. My sister and I are sitting there. And we're watching them, you know, and they're having all the fun. But we're just in this little, I mean, our bottoms are wet. That's about all. We're not having any fun. Our bottoms are wet. That's about it. So I scooched a little further into the side of the creek. Tina didn't remarkably. She was sitting up on the bank. I scooched a little bit in. I mean, after all, I was bigger. I needed more water. And the water came up a little higher. And my dad looked over there and says, boy, you better get back up on that bank, you know. And I'm like, you know, okay. So I scooshed back a little bit. That made it even funner because now my butt had dug a hole in the bank. Now, so I was sitting in deeper water. Even funny, even more fun. Now I could just barely see my toes dangling up above the water. This was fun, you know. But I'm back up where Tina's at now, you know. And then they get out there and they get all distracted doing their things. And I'm like, you know what? So I pushed myself a little bit further out there. Now I'm sinking deeper in the, and so I'm now the same distance got me deeper in the water, you know. And I'm like, oh look, now my waist is covered. Now my feet are starting to do this in the water. I am having fun. And all of a sudden there's my dad. Boy, get back up there with your sister, you know. So I pushed myself back up there, and of course I dug a deeper trench on the way back up. Now I'm even in deeper water. This is so much fun, right? And so they got really busy doing something and laughing and cutting up. I waited until they were very, very, and so I thought, now we go for the gusto, you know. I'm going to push myself far enough down on the side of this bank that I can get the water up to my chest. Oh yeah, we're going to do this. Now, Tina was really, really young, you understand. She wasn't old enough for me to get her up to tricks yet. So she's up on the bank. So I give myself a push to get deep out there. But I have been digging a trench, okay, loosening up that soil. So when I gave it that push, that soil gave out. Okay? And when that soil gave out, I went head back, feet first, straight into that water. I mean, all I saw was brown sunshine. I have no idea how deep I got. I have no idea what happened. I just know I was completely immersed under the water. All I could see was the sunshine coming up and bubbles coming out of my mouth. And I was flailing my arms, but I wasn't going anywhere. And the next thing I know, okay, whoosh, I'm coming up out of that water, and I'm standing on the bank. And it's my dad, you know, who saw me do it, okay? And you would think this would be a wonderful, loving, father-son bonding, heroic moment, okay? Well, first of all, I came up out of the water going, Mama, Mama, Mama. I was crying for Mama, but it was Dad who did the saving. But I wasn't going, Daddy, Daddy. I was going, Mama, Mama, Mama. Let us just say I needed that cool water after that. And especially on that area that I had the cool water on before, because my daddy wasn't. And this time, I was sitting on a dry bank. And I wasn't allowed back in the water anymore. Because I hadn't done. Now, Tina's still down there in the water. She's sitting there. She hadn't moved out from where she said that earlier. She's just down there splashing in the water, you know, just having fun. But I'm up on the bank now, on the dry bank, and soaking wet, by the way. And everybody's down in the water having fun, and I'm on the bank because I didn't do what I was told to do because I was warned. This is as far as you can go. Don't go any further than this. Why? Because that river bank came out. Think about it. They were standing on a barrel in the middle of the river. So that means that bank came out and went, foop. Okay, well, Dad knew that bank came out and went, foop. That's why he put me where he put me, because I was up in the shallower part. But if I kept moving out, I was going to eventually hit that. That's what happened. I kept digging until I got down to the level of the drop, and then everything just gave out, and I went down, which is exactly what he was trying to prevent. So, but I didn't listen. I didn't give in to what he said. And so now I lost my privilege of playing in the water. I was muddy, I was dirty, I was wet, now I was cold, and I didn't get to play in the water. And they played in that water for quite some time after I was sitting on the bank because they weren't in any hurry. It was a nice summer's weekend or whatever it was. But I remember it to this day. I remember it. And I also, and that my dad's warning from there on out cost me a lot of fun. But I never sank in the bank either on any given situation. When my dad would go, don't do that, there's something about that day that just stuck with me. And I just wouldn't push him. Okay, well, I want to do it, but you don't want to push him. Because when Dad said don't do it, it wasn't because he's trying to spoil your fun. He knew something about the situation you didn't know, and he didn't feel like it was necessary to explain it to you at this particular time. You were just supposed to trust him. And God sets landmarks for a purpose. Okay? And even when the children of Israel went in there and they set up their land and negotiated their landmarks from tribe to house, God gave them the parameters of Israel, right? By the way, I don't think they've ever actually owned the full chunk of land that they were gifted by God. But he gives them that land, then he lets them go in there, and they get to talk and set up the boundaries. And God says, once the boundaries are set up, don't mess with them. Leave the boundaries alone. Okay? Work within your boundaries. Okay? If you start pushing it, you understand, you can sit there on the fence. Okay? But if you go over to the other side of that boundary, if you lose your boundary, you understand things are not going to go very well for you. Stay within your boundaries. Keep within your boundaries. Now, I realize these particular proverbs and these ideas do deal with physical land, and they're trying to encourage people to deal honestly with one another, be good neighbors to one another, and stuff like that. But obviously, if you read the commentaries on these things, people tend to broaden this concept out a little bit. And boundaries, not so much as physical boundaries that keep you from going, for land ownership and things like that. But it could also be, cultural boundaries, societal boundaries, okay? Things that are set up that are meant, that seem like they're restrictive, but they're meant to protect as much as they are to restrict. You can't be like Ahab, have your boundary and then covet your neighbor's boundary as well. It's not yours. Well, but his vineyards are growing better. Well, but maybe you're not meant to be a vineyard grower. Okay? Well, his land is better. The old proverb, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And then the retort to that, but it may be artificial turf or growing over a septic tank. And so what may appear, or you wouldn't want the water bill. And we were driving up and down our neighborhood, and some of our neighbors have really nice little patches of grass, I could say, out in the front, or at least they look like grass. It could be artificial turf. But that was with the conversation. And my wife said, I'd love to have something like that. I said, yeah, but I wouldn't want to pay the water bill to have something like that. And then she goes, well, it could be artificial turf. I said, well, that's true. It could be artificial turf. But that's just it. You drive by it and you go, ooh, doesn't that look good? But you don't really understand what it costs, the time, the effort, or the fact that it may not even be real. It just looks really good, Don't worry, there's plenty of people in my neighborhood have worse lawns than me. That's why I take the long route sometimes, just to encourage myself. And my lawn doesn't look that bad. And but there are, people always look over the boundary and think it's so much better on the other side of the boundary. But once again, like that old proverb, you don't know why that grass is green. You don't know if it's even real grass. It's better to stay where you're at and enjoy, your area that God has given you. So let's say God puts up boundaries. Okay? Let's say he sets up boundaries, not necessarily physical boundaries, but maybe moral boundaries. And God says, he commanded the Gentiles in the book of Acts, abstain from fornication, and meat strangle offered unto idols. Well, that seems awful. If you're raised in that Gentile world, that seems awful restrictive, and that just doesn't seem like it's necessary. After all, I love people's expressions. We're not under the law. We're under grace. Well, if you'll do an honest observation of a comparison between grace and what we're talking about, New Testament and Old Testament law, grace is a lot more restrictive. The law had an anti-murder clause, right? Grace is an anti-hate clause. The law never said anything about hating. It never said it was wrong to hate your brother. It just said it was wrong to kill him. Now, it may have taken hate into consideration if you killed someone and you didn't hate them and it was an accident and it's manslaughter and there were provisions for you, versus if you hated him and you killed him intentionally and now it was murder and there was no provision for you. You know what I'm saying? But the law wasn't about hate or non-hate. It was about murder. But when you get to the New Testament, Jesus starts teaching, it ain't about physically killing. It's about, do you hate him? Do you? Because if you hate him, you're as good as killing him as far as I'm concerned. See, grace is much more restrictive. Oh, yeah. Let's talk about adultery. In the Old Testament, it's pretty obvious what adultery was, right? Jesus teaches on it, says, have you looked on a woman and lusted after her in your heart? You're good as committed adultery right there. Wow, that's awful. Wow, that's awful. Woo, that's awful strict, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about going from physically committing adultery to just thinking about it. In the Old Testament, you didn't get in trouble unless you'd physically done it. In the New Testament, you get in trouble for thinking about it. And people say, we're not under the law, we're under grace. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're using it as an excuse to break down some boundaries, but what you don't realize is grace has tighter boundaries. Because grace looks at your attitude more than it looks at your actions. Because grace, because we're beyond physical actions, we're looking at motivations. We're beyond restraining physical behavior to altering attitudes and mindsets so that we don't have to worry about the physical behavior. Grace is far more restrictive. The New Testament's far more restrictive if you actually do a comparison. Because in the Old Testament, under the law, it was the physical act. You had to commit the physical act in order to be guilty of anything and be punished. But in the New Testament, you just have to have the attitude. In the Old Testament, you had to have a physical idol. And you had to fall down to that physical idol and worship it to be an idolater. Is that what you have to have in the New Testament? No. Anything you put above God, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a physical idol, as we think of idols. Could be your car. Could be your family. Could be your spouse. Anything you put above God becomes an idol because you are making it more important to you than God, and God counts it out. That's New Testament. That's grace. Think about it. The Old Testament, we got 4 commandments, what to do with God, and 6 commandments, what to do with each other. And then Jesus comes around and says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all, right? Because it's a lot more intense. In the Old Testament, I don't take the Lord's name in vain. I remember the Sabbath day. I don't have any idols, right? What's the other one? There's no other God before me. I have no other God. Right? I'm good. I've got the 4. Where's the intensity of the love that Jesus describes in the New Testament? But when Jesus gets down in the New Testament, you've got to love him with all. Wow. What about the other 6? Well, I've not taken my neighbor's wife. I've honored my mom and dad. I haven't stolen. I haven't killed. I haven't bear false witness. Yeah, but have you loved them like you love yourself? Well, I see. Because see, the law, as restrictive as people complain about it, is nothing compared to grace, which looks at motive and intent. The law simply said, this is what you physically need to do, hoping, that there would be love behind it. But that was the revelation that Christ gave to the law keepers, that your physical restrictions that you've placed on yourself, and you think because you're doing all these things that you're pleasing God, but you're doing all these things, but your heart's not in it. Because you can physically do things to look spiritual. You can physically do things that people would interpret as, well, you must love God. Look at that. You do this all the time. But in reality, you're not doing it for the love of God. You're doing it for the love of self, for the love of your societal position, to keep your network of friends or business connections or whatever the case. But there's not a true love for God there. And you can do things for your fellow human being for the purpose of being praised for it, or getting a tax write-off, or I'm saying that's the motivation for it. One thing, when they restricted a lot of what would be charitable giving from doing that for big corporations, and the big corporations, well, it wasn't the big corporations that threw a fit, it was the charities that threw a fit, because they knew without these tax breaks, they weren't going to get the donations. And the president then at the time, though he wasn't well liked, and a lot of the things he did made, I thought, a very astute observation. He said they shouldn't be giving for a tax break in the first place. Well, I agree. They shouldn't be. But I'm going to tell you right now, they didn't give for humanitarian causes. They gave for the tax break. Now, somebody may have grabbed that money and done a lot of humanitarian things with it. Okay, and those people who gave were praised for giving to their, but they didn't care about that, because take the tax break away and they ain't giving. So this is no longer profits them to give. You say, how could it profit to give? Because they ain't going to give unless it's going to help their bottom line. So as soon as it ceases to profit them to give, they're not going to give. It's that simple. Because they don't give because they love their neighbor as themselves. They give to make a profit. They give because it benefits them to give. And a lot of people do that. They like to be praised. They like to be the center of attention. They like, so they'll do things. Because look, when they do it, they have a big fanfare when they do it, don't they? Oh, there she is, this celebrity. You know what I'm saying? Always getting their, she's really, she's doing it for publicity stunt. No, the orphans may benefit from it somewhere down the line. But ultimately, she's doing it for a publicity stunt. Okay? Very rarely do you find some of these celebrities who do these things who don't do it for notoriety. And as the British expression, give them a Jew. Dolly Parton had hundreds of charities going on in the background nobody knew anything about. And she was found out. Because she wasn't posing for a picture. Again, not making her more than what she is. I'm just saying. But you could honestly say in that particular, unless she's the one that leaked the information, but as it appeared at least, okay, she was found out that she had all these charitable things she was doing in the background. She didn't let anybody know that she was doing it. She was just doing it, okay? And that's a big difference between those who do it for a publicity, and they want you to know they're doing it. Oh, I've got this foundation, donate to this, or or I'm doing that, and they want you to know what they're doing. And sometimes they say, well, because I want to bring attention to the kids. And how come it's your face I see all the time? How come it's you? How come you're the only thing I associate with this, not the actual people you're supposedly helping? Sounds like it's more about you than it is about them. But anyway, you have the boundaries of the Old Testament, okay, were much more simple. And you could get away with a lot more because as long as you did it, okay, you were okay, whether how you felt about it, right? But you can't get away with that in the New Testament. You can't just do it in the New Testament. Your heart has to be right about it too, or it's an unacceptable sacrifice in the sight of God. I can't tell you something. It was always an unacceptable sacrifice to God, but the boundaries were just a lot bigger. Okay, and so God allowed them to do it without the right heart until eventually they just stopped doing it. And then God rained down on them and he punished them. But in the New Testament, he looks at your heart. Where is your heart? Where is it? It's a much tougher thing to monitor your thoughts and your feelings than it is to monitor where your feet and your hands go. Much harder. And so sometimes people, I know we had that whole thing about culture versus faith, and I thought this was really appropriate, these verses, because sometimes people, they do go over the top, I think, in some ways, and I believe I've expressed that. I think they do go over the top, but I think somebody who goes over the top for the right reasons, okay, is better than someone who's pushing the boundaries for the wrong reasons, right? And then turns around, looks back at the person who may have gone over the top for the right reasons. Maybe they didn't really have to go that far, but their heart was in it and they just wanted to be as far back from the edge of the cliffs as they could be. Okay? And then the people that are walking around look back at them and call them legalists. When in reality, they're not doing anything they're doing in order to get saved. They just want to be as close to God as they possibly can. And it may not even be that they're trying to spoil anybody else's fun and saying they need to walk back here either, if that's what you want to do. But inevitably, okay, you'll have that group right there on the edge that looks back at the other group and says, "You're just," that's the word, that's the religious word they like to use. You're a legalist. Now, the reason why is because the word legalist had an original simple meaning, and it was very negative. And just like Satan likes to take these things and twist them, now he turns around and he takes it and redefines it, which if anybody looked at the original definition, they'd never be able to say that this is legalism. But what carries with it is that negativism that comes with it. Legalism used to be about adding works to salvation. Okay, you are a legalist because you believe you had to keep the law in order to be saved. Right? That's a legalist. A legalist is not someone who just chooses to walk the path that's a little further away from the edge of the cliff. Unless they're doing it to be saved. Okay? Now they're doing it to work their way to heaven. They're legalists. Because if you add works or the law to your salvation, then you are a legalist. That's the basic definition. But if you just simply happen to want to walk a little further back from the edge of the cliff, okay, so that you don't violate God's law or step over God's boundaries, it doesn't make you a legalist. Okay? Now, if you think you're better than everybody else, that still doesn't make you a legalist. It just makes you a rotten attitude. And God will judge that attitude. Your distance back from the edge of the cliff means nothing because your heart's already gone over the edge of the cliff. That's a New Testament versus Old Testament. Old Testament would say this guy with a superior attitude would still be righteous because of the fact that they're so far from the edge of the cliff. The problem is in the New Testament, and God says, well, you're not, because in your heart you've already fallen over the cliff. And that's the difference between what's in the New Testament and what's in the Old Testament, that God would not discourage someone from walking further back from the cliff, but he isn't going to praise them if their attitude is bad. For instance, we have the example of the giving in the New Testament, where he commends the Pharisees for taking tithes of anise and mint and all these other things. But, right, these things you ought to do. But then he said there were weightier matters to the law, didn't he? Justice. These are things of the heart. And this is where the Pharisees and the Sadducees always messed up. They were clean as a whistle on the outside. But that's why Jesus says you're like a whited sepulcher. You're nice and whitewashed and clean on the outside, but you're full of dead men's bones on the inside. You see, they had managed to create a system in which they looked better and acted better, and they were morally better than everybody else around them. Okay? Except one place, in the heart. And this is where they failed miserably. One, because they did all this thinking they were better than everybody else. They did this because they were legalists. They believed they had to do this to get to heaven. But even on worse, they thought they were better than everybody else because they did do it. And so Christ came around and he absolutely that's why he destroyed them. Because I know what's in your heart. Okay? Well, this is the one place they had never managed to truly protect themselves from. They can look good on the outside, but when you're putting up that pretense, you know you're hollow on the inside. And when someone can call it out like he called it, of course he's God, I understand, he sees in the heart. But when someone calls, that's why these Pharisees dropped away like flies a lot of times around him, because they couldn't stand it. Because he went past all the robes and phylacteries and ceremonies and feast days and big fancy prayers and, you know what I'm saying? And all the debates and discussions about the Torah and the Talmud and all that kind of stuff. He went right past it and went straight into their hearts. And there, none of that stuff they were doing were making any bit of a difference. Okay? And they knew it. They knew they weren't righteous. They knew. That's why when we get to the book of Acts after the resurrection, We have scores and just hundreds of these Pharisees coming to Christ. And many of the leaders of the churches were like Paul, were Pharisees. Because ultimately, they were the leaders that led him but he was making inroads into those Pharisees. Because they all knew they were white as sepulchres. He called them out. They knew, even though they looked good on the outside, they were just dead on the inside. They knew it. They knew it was a failing legalistic system that wasn't going anywhere. Okay? And so he went straight to the heart of the matter. And that's why I think once the resurrection took place and the apostles stood, saying, and that's why so many of the Pharisees suddenly started turning, because they, I think, in all honesty, were looking for redemption and salvation. They just thought it was in this legalistic system. Whereas the Sadducees were all about the earth. They weren't looking for a spirit. There wasn't a spiritual world to them. They weren't looking for that. But the Pharisees were. So they knew there was something more to life than just the here and now, and they knew there was something more. They were just couldn't quite figure out how to get there. They had gone astray when it came. They misinterpreted the law. They misinterpreted everything. But at least they understood there was a spiritual world, and that there was another life, and there was life after death, and there was. You've seen the debates in the scriptures whether that was the conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And all of a sudden, here comes somebody who goes past this world and straight to their hearts. And his message isn't about this world. It's about what's inside. It's completely different. He goes beyond it. And then that's why I think you have Pharisees, like I said, getting saved by the droves when you get to the book of Acts, because it finally resonated with them. They figured it out, in droves they figured it out. But we also know that they came with baggage. And this is where we end up with all the conflicts between the Jews and the Gentiles within churches, which ultimately led them to the conclusion, we know our Judaism doesn't save us, but this is the way we were raised. Nothing bad about it, unless you're using it to get to heaven, and we're not doing that anymore. And there's nothing wrong with the temple. There's nothing wrong with, Paul would argue against it, but with giving blood sacrifices, Paul would argue against that, because, saying, I would argue on the side of Paul there, because you shouldn't be doing something that's a picture of something that's already been fulfilled. But let's face it, at the end of the day, it's not like they're offering idols offering unto idols or anything. Saying there's nothing wrong with them keeping their feast days, nothing wrong with not eating pork, nothing wrong with them wearing their phylacteries if they want to. As long as they're not doing it to get to heaven, they understand true salvation is in the Lord Jesus Christ, and they understand that. But then here comes the Gentiles getting saved. Well, the Gentiles don't have this culture at all. Their culture's a lot of times perverted and wicked. And there was that conflict, because here we are, we've got our high moral standards based on the laws of Moses. Yes, we misinterpreted it. But these aren't bad customs, and these aren't bad traditions, in and of themselves. We were using them wrong. We were thinking we're better than everybody else because we had them. But at the end of the day, we can point to God with these prayer shawls and these phylacteries and these, we can actually show Christ in some of these traditions that developed, and help explain Jesus better. There's a lot of good we can do with these things. Okay, yes, wonderful. But the Gentiles don't come with that kind of thing. They got their own problems over here, and they're coming into this thing. So what do we do? Because we can't turn around, as the debate was, and laden them with all these Jewish traditions that didn't do us any good as far as getting to heaven either. So why would we put that on them? We're going to do it, but we're not going to ask them to do it, because in the end of the day, it's about our hearts. It's not about our outsides, right? Now again, Paul takes issue sometimes with these things, okay? Especially when people who claim to be keeping, want to do this, suddenly when there's nobody else around that does it, then they live like Gentiles, like Peter. And then when the Jews show up, suddenly they've got this strict culture. I don't think Paul would have had a problem with Peter at all not eating with the Gentiles if he didn't do it because he thought it was better, and and behaving like a Jew when whether the Jews were there or not. It was his flippy floppy back and forth that Paul took issue with. It's like, wait a minute, what are you doing? A minute ago, when it's just you and me and these guys, man, you're right down there eating a hot dog made out of 100% pork. All of a sudden, here comes this delegation from the church back in Jerusalem, and here they come in the door, and all of a sudden, you won't even spend time with the Gentiles. What kind of nonsense is this? You know, that was addressed many times in the Pauline epistles, that hypocrisy and that double standard and looking down on those Gentiles, and then he would go back to the very reality of, hey, none of that stuff you did anything. Okay? Not going to say it's a bad thing to do if you just want to do it. Okay? But at the same time, but you know what? How much worse would it have been for the Gentiles to rise up and call them legalists when they really weren't? Or to rise up and persecute them because they want to wear their phylacteries to church? Would that not be just as bad? If they stood over there going, hey, we're Gentiles for Jesus, and we're going to run you Jews out of town because you're not acting like, you're still acting like you did back when you thought you were working your way to heaven. You still have all those traditions and cultures. Would that not be wrong? Of course it would be. Because in reality, the boundaries in the New Testament are about what's on in here. And so a Gentile that would rise up and call the Jew a legalist simply because, even though he's not doing it to get to heaven anymore, okay, he just enjoys his culture, it's what he's raised in, it's what he's comfortable with, and he enjoys doing it. There's no prohibitions against it, he's just doing it. For him to rise up and call him a legalist and persecute him because of the fact that he's living a more restricted life, though he's not requiring the Gentile to do it, okay, would be just as wrong as if it flipped the other way and the Jews said, well, all the Gentiles have to be circumcised and have to do this and that and the other, or they can't be a part of this. Right? Because where is the real boundary now is not the outside. The real boundary is the inside. And the minute you start doing stuff like that, you've already stepped over the cliff in your heart. You're already beyond what Christ expected. You see? So we live in a world and a time where boundaries are moving. Why are boundaries moving? Boundaries are moving because one side that claims to be living in grace really isn't. Okay? They really aren't, because they're turning around and throwing accusations at people over here who happen to be living a little more strict conservative life than them, calling them legalists, labeling them incorrectly, maligning them, okay, because they choose to happen to live this way. They're not doing it to get to heaven. They just want to live that way. I know people who I know are born again as anybody else is born again, but they like living like the Amish. They're not Amish even. They wouldn't even claim to be Amish. They like that lifestyle. Okay? Frankly, I don't want to get up and move horse muck and cow muck every morning. Okay? I'm not into that. Okay? This is not my word. It stinks. It's huge. It's big. I got other things to do with my life. Okay? But that's the way they want to live. And and their wife runs around with a little, when we first thought, I'm going to be honest, we thought, did they convert to Amish? They hadn't. They just liked that life and that look. Well, I don't particularly care to my life look, but I'm not going to throw accusations at them. If that's the way they want it, fine. As long as you're not doing it to get yourself to heaven, as long as, you're in love with Christ and you're going to church, and you're loving on Christ and worshiping the way He wants to worship, if that's how you particularly want to look and that's the way you want to live, more power to you. I support you. I ain't coming out and helping you rake them up, but I'm more power to you. I'm not buying some eggs off of you, but more power to you. And some milk, I ain't going to do, more power to you. Okay? There are people who believe it is their calling to repopulate the entire world. Okay? And totally misread Scripture because Abraham had so many sons and Isaac, they forget the women didn't have that many. The man did because he was a polygamist, but the women didn't have 12, 13, 20 children apiece. Okay? Maybe Eve. I don't know how many she had. But at the same time, what I'm saying? But more power to you if that's what you want to do. Knock yourself out. Okay? But don't look down at everybody else who may not have kids or have more than one kid, because they're not trying to repopulate the earth on their own. But I know people who are like that. They look down on Susan and I because we don't have any children. They mock us and insult us because we don't have any, and say we're not right with God because we don't have kids. We didn't have anything to do with it. Can I tell you something? And I'm not just defending myself here, but when you got that attitude toward a couple like Susan and I, you've stepped over the cliff. You've stepped over the cliff. Okay? I'm glad God gave you 27 children. Okay? Alexa's like, no, I got one and she's enough. I couldn't imagine 27 Porsches running around. I just wouldn't be able to deal with this. My hair wouldn't be short because I cut it short. It'd just be gone because it'd be out of my head if I had to deal with 27 Porsches. But is that I'm sorry, did I go too long? He's just here early because it's not 1 o'clock. Anyway. But anyway, I will drown down because I've basically said everything. I'm just thinking of more and more illustrations as I go, but I'll just stop it right there. But again, remove not the ancient landmarks. What does it mean? It means don't mess with the boundaries God set up. Okay? Don't desire someone else's boundaries. Don't mock someone else's boundaries, right? Let's just enjoy the boundaries God has set up. Ah, there she goes. Just one Porsche. Lex, that was funny. He's like, there's enough work just for one. And but at any rate, and have a great week, Mary.